Welcome, everyone. I am Julie Zuckerman, author of the Book of Jeremiah, and welcome to the September Literary Modiin author event. 11 months ago, our lives were forever changed, and now we're on day 345, and we are still waiting and praying for all of our hostages to return home. And I'll say a few more words about that at the end of the session. But now I want to turn to something joyful, and that is the release of new Jewish books into the world. If you're not familiar with Literary Modiin, or where we are, even Modiin is like halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, very close to the airport. We had a little excitement today. But we began Literary Modiin about 5+ years ago, and it's grown into a monthly event with authors and attendees from all over the world. And this is our 53rd event. The format of today's event is that each author will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. And we have a large attendance, so everyone is on mute, but you can put your questions in the chat box. And if you have any technical difficulties, just send me a private note in the chat. Okay, I'm going to introduce our first author, Sasha Vasilyuk. I'm gonna have to correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Is a journalist and author of debut novel Your Presence is Mandatory, which was longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize and has been translated into 6 languages. Sasha grew up between Ukraine and Russia before immigrating to the US at the age of 13. She has a BA from UC Berkeley and an MA in journalism from NYU. Her nonfiction has been published in the New York Times, Harper's Bazaar, CNN, Time, and elsewhere. And she is the recipient of a Solace Award for Best Travel Writing, a North American Travel Journalists Association Award, and a Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive Fellowship from UC Berkeley. She lives in San Francisco with her husband and children, but she is actually coming to us now from the south of France. So, Sasha, let me spotlight you and unmute you, and then you can take it away.
Hi, everybody. Julie, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. And I have 15 minutes, so let me look. Okay, it's 10:04 on this computer. So, okay, at 10:19. This is my novel. Ooh, it gets blurred. Your Presence is Mandatory. It's what it's called. It's very red in the US edition. Other countries completely changed the cover and the title. So it's a different book in every place, which is kind of funny and strange. So this novel this is how it's pitched it's how it's described by Bloomsbury, my publisher. A riveting debut novel based on real events about a World War II veteran with a secret that could land him in the Gulag and his family, who are forced to live in the shadow of all he has not told them. I'm going to start by reading you like a kind of 2 combined little pieces from chapter 1. And I think that will set us up nicely for some things that I'll tell you about the backstory of how my book came to be. So chapter 1 takes place in 2007 in Donetsk, Ukraine, which is in the Donbass. Nina watched her husband fish out a heap of papers from his leather briefcase and lock himself in the bathroom. She heard Yefim strike a match and soon smelled the sweet smoke of old paper burning. Nina didn't stop him. What was the point? She liked her room neat. She too had been getting rid of things. Whenever their grandkids or her former students came by, she gave away Pushkin tomes or the rare rocks she'd collected on her paleontological expeditions through the USSR. But since no one would care for a dying man's documents, he may as well burn them. He could have, of course, just tossed them and spared their daughter, Vita, the worry that he might set fire to the apartment, but Nina liked Yefim's sudden penchant for the dramatic. In his own mind, at least, his life must have seemed more interesting. It wasn't easy watching her husband of more than 50 years turn smaller, more fragile, more erratic. After destroying his papers, it was as if he'd given up. Soon, there was no more going to the bathroom by himself, only the plastic toilet in the middle of the room that he'd nicknamed his throne. The worst was when he rolled off the bed and howled, "Don't hit me," in this pitiful voice she'd never heard before. Nina was relieved when he was more lucid on Victory Day, so the great-grandkids could congratulate him properly. It was important for this pampered 21st century generation to remember that Yefim was a war hero. But soon after, he got worse again, until one morning when Nina awoke with her usual "Rise and sing, Fima," and he didn't respond. His silence felt like a slap. I'm going to skip a couple of pages, basically skipping funeral and the wake. And then 40 days after. Finally, on the 40th day, Vita uncovered the mirrors. It was a hot July morning, but the lavender haze settled over the slack heaps. As Vita packed Yefim's clothes and bedding into 2 large bags, one for the poor, the other to be burned outside the city, Nina began dusting. After all the usual places were clean, she crouched in front of Yefim's bed. From underneath it, she pulled out the leather briefcase he'd lugged around since the 1950s. "Well, we can finally get rid of this old thing," she told her daughter. She remembered how when they first moved in together to that little house on the outskirts of Kiev, he'd brought this briefcase along with a small bag of clothes and the oddly shaped brass mug, his only possessions. He told her right away that the briefcase had his private papers, and she understood that she wasn't to open it, not that she was curious. Now Nina wiped the dust off its leather and checked to make sure it was empty before adding it to Vita's growing pile. The inside smelled of the last century, of diesel, trains, iodine, and ink. She was about to close the flap when she noticed the spine of a thin beige envelope in one of the compartments. He must have forgotten to burn it. She pulled it out. If this was one of the soap operas she liked to watch, inside she'd find something exciting, like photographs he'd hidden away, or maybe even a love letter from some adoring woman. Instead, she found a dull, yellowing photocopy filled with Yefim's immaculate cursive. Though she couldn't make out the individual words, it certainly didn't look like a love letter. "Read this, Vitachka," she said. "Make sure it's nothing worth saving." Vita put on her glasses and took the letter. "It's from April 1984, Vita said. Nina remembered 1984 was the year Chernenko became the general secretary, just for 1 year before he died and Gorbachev stepped in to finish off the country they'd all stopped believing in. Nina wished she could stop associating time with general secretaries, but there was no changing how Soviet memory worked. "You better sit, Mamachka," Vita said in a hollow voice. "It's addressed to the KGB." Nina began to feel a little clammy. What would the KGB want with your father? She crawled toward her bed and pulled herself up onto the edge of the mattress, the dust cloth still in her hand. Vita began to read aloud. "To the head of the Regional Committee of State Security, I am writing to address the inconsistencies discovered in my military record. However, I must first say that my children and grandchildren love me very much, and it would be a big psychological trauma for them to find out what I'm about to report." I'll finish my reading there. That's the end of the first chapter. And afterward, the next chapter jumps to 1941, on the eve of Hitler's attack on the USSR in June. And I wanted to share a little bit of backstory of sort of what this book is about, how I came to it. As Julie mentioned, I grew up both in Ukraine and in Russia, and then I moved to the States. And I, until a year ago, had family in both. And actually my other grandma, not the one that's described here, is buried in Israel near Jerusalem. But this story is based loosely on my real grandparents who lived in Ukraine, in Donetsk, in the Donbass, from kind of a couple years after World War II until a few years ago when my grandma passed away. My grandfather was a World War II veteran, and like many World War II veterans, not just in Soviet Union, but in many places, he never talked about the war. And there was sort of this feeling that you weren't supposed to ask either. And in 2007, he passed away in the manner described similarly in the book. And a few weeks later, my grandma found a letter, and kind of the quote that I read to you is a direct quote from that letter. So my family discovered that what we perceive, what has always been described to us as kind of, he doesn't talk about the war, but he's a war hero because he fought from the first day of the war until the last day of the war 4 years later and participated in the Battle of Berlin, which finished the war in Europe. That was so rare that somebody would survive for that long. And he was Jewish on top of it, that essentially, once you have kind of those facts, you assume that he's a war hero. He also told the story that he had all these medals, but they were stolen on his train back home. And it turned out that that was very much a myth that he made up, and the letter, which is addressed to the KGB and dates back to the 80s, explains to the KGB what really took place and how he was able, as a Jewish soldier in Stalin's army, to survive World War II. He was, well, I don't think this is a huge spoiler because there's a lot of information online about the book by now, but basically he gets captured pretty early on in the war and becomes a prisoner of war. Growing up in kind of Soviet and post-Soviet culture, the only thing I ever knew or ever heard about prisoners of war is like the Russian word for prisoners of war. And the other thing I knew about it was that it's something you're supposed to be kind of ashamed of. There's this phrase in Russian that translates to "sat out the war." And in kind of Stalin and post-Stalin culture in Soviet Union, essentially prisoners of war were perceived as people who were sort of guilty of sitting out the war at the very least, and at the most that they collaborated and were somehow influenced by their captors, by the Nazis, to then become, but all the way to enemies of the people. So what often ended up happening is that after they survived captivity in Germany or work labor or various ways that Germans used them, they were then sent back to Soviet Union, and a certain percentage of them was then sent to the Gulag, to the Soviet camps, after surviving the German camps. None of this I knew at the time of discovering the letter. And in 2007, when this letter was found, I was in my 20s. I wanted to be a writer, but I wasn't quite ready to sort of write a long novel. I also didn't think it was very urgent to write yet another World War II book. It felt to me like the story is very interesting because of all the adventures that he had to survive, and the fact that he was able to hide it from the government and from his family for decades to come. I thought that there's a novel there, but I just didn't think I was the one to write it. And then in 2014, war came to Ukraine. I hope by now most of you know, but if not, I'll just mention it, that 2022 is what we call the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but the conflict there began in 2014 after Russia took over Crimea and then kind of started a scuffle, if you will, in the Donbass, specifically in the city where my grandparents and most of my family lived, a city that I visited every summer my entire life, and a city that was quiet and peaceful and quite booming right before that. So in 2014, this war starts very suddenly, and it creates a lot of refugees. My cousins and my nephews became refugees, but my grandma, on whom kind of Nina is loosely based, stayed. She was in her 90s. And she was like, I survived the Nazis. Like, these guys have nothing on me. I'm not going to go anywhere. When I kept asking her to leave the city. So she stayed, and my aunt and uncle stayed with her. And then a couple of years later, in 2016, I was able to visit her. It was the last time I got to see my grandma. And it was the last time I went to Ukraine. I was able to kind of cross through the Russian border with my brother, and the city that I'd visited my entire life was just completely nothing like, it was unrecognizable. Half the people were gone. Most of the people I saw were over 50. Kind of everyone younger was no longer there. And there were bullet holes and everything. There were signs for bomb shelters everywhere. There was martial law. I guess to those of you, I'm assuming a lot of you are in Israel, and so maybe this stuff isn't maybe as shocking as it was to me, but I never thought that I would see war come back to Ukraine or to Europe in that way in the 21st century, nor that it was going to be perpetrated by the country to which I also belong, by Russia. So it tore, I mean, as you know, it tore apart that entire part of the world and continues to in devastating ways. So in my novel, I realized that this new war in Ukraine is actually very much connected to World War II. I won't go into it for a long time, but basically Putin is using the national trauma of World War II as part of his propaganda to kind of formulate why this war against Ukraine now makes sense. For anybody who knows enough about World War II or who even reads my novel or any other novel based on real experience of people who were there, you'll be very clear that a lot of what he's saying is completely bullshit. But if you don't know, and if your grandparents or your parents never talked about what happened to them, and your entire information source comes from textbooks in Russia, for example, they're approved by the government, then you're not going to know what history was really like. And so with my novel that goes back between World War II and the decades from the 50s until 2014, until this new Ukraine war, I'm trying to kind of recreate the real history of what was happening through this one family of Yefim, Nina, his children, and his grandchildren that are all kind of dealing with shame and fear of the government, shame of your own past, and secrecy that kind of permeates not just this family, but society overall. I think that's my time, so I'm going to stop talking. Thank you guys so much. Thanks, Julie, for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sasha. Personally, just been learning a bit more about Crimea because my son's girlfriend is from there, and she came to Israel as a 15-year-old by herself, right, in 2015 after Russia took over. So I don't remember which cities she's from though. So anyway, let me introduce our next author. Okay. Batnadiv HaKarmi's work has appeared in numerous literary journals, including the Elan Note Review, Arc Poetry Magazine, Rouge Agent, and Belmont Story Review. Her chapbook, The Love of Mortal Beings, was published by Kelsey Books in 2023 and received a Pushcart nomination. Her biography of Holocaust rescue activist Pinchas Rosenbaum is upcoming from Geffen Publishing. A writer and visual artist, Batnadiv studied painting at the New York Studio School and holds an MA in creative writing from Bar-Ilan University. She is the recipient of the Andrea Morea Poetry Prize and was shortlisted for the Brideport Prize for Flash Fiction and the Harbor Review's Jewish Women's Poetry Prize. Born in Stanford, California, she grew up in Jerusalem, where she currently resides with her husband and 4 young children. So, Batnadiv, let me spotlight you. Okay.
Hey. Julie, I just wanted to say thanks for getting me out. I realized, like, when you started saying after October 7th, I'm like, after October 7th, I don't actually go out at night. And I don't think I've been out. It's like I had to kind of run away to our storage room to get away from the kids. But I was like, wow, I'm getting away from the kids and I'm trying to think about something other than immediate concerns. So thank you so much for doing this. And Sasha, it was fascinating hearing you. And I feel like it's also kind of serendipity because even though my book is a chapbook and yours is a novel, they're both dealing with grandparents. They're both dealing with grandparents who survived World War II and kind of the aftermath that comes after, you know, when they pass away and suddenly you've got to go through all the information, which, as you said, is just not shared. And so I grew up not really knowing my grandfather's brothers' names. I kind of knew he had a sister because he mentioned it once. And like I knew that there were certain names that repeated in my family, so I assumed they were family members, but it just was not spoken about. And after my grandparents passed away, my grandmother passed away several years before my grandfather, and it was kind of like I needed to begin going through it, and it kept coming up in all my writing. But like you said, I did not think that this was the book I was going to write. I was working on something else, and yet it just kept coming up and coming up and coming up. And finally, my grandfather's diary was published, and that was kind of, they took his wartime writing. They were written on all these old scraps of paper. And after his death, it was given to the Center for Holocaust Research, and his writing was published. And like for the first time, I was like, okay, I need to kind of go through this. So this is the chapbook. It's called The Love of Mortal Beings. It's a very dark cover. The painting is by my friend. And this book does not deal with the diary. I wrote a very, very long thing about the diary, which I'm still writing. But what ended up happening is there were all these personal poems about just my grandfather and my grandmother. And I realized it's its own series, and that became a chapbook. To those of you who aren't in the poetry world, a chapbook is a very small focused book of poetry that deals with a single theme, up to 70 pages max, usually 50. And I realized these are their own series. And most of writing this book was actually a process of elimination and figuring out which poems fit into this very, very tight container of just my grandparents' relationship, one with the other, and kind of how that trickled down to the family. I'm going to start by reading also one of the blurbs that was written in the back. And what Professor Sulak wrote is, imagine that all remains of people you once loved more than life are names. Imagine that the power to name is the power to control the conduit of souls to and from the afterworld. Imagine a couple caught in the aftermath of the Holocaust, struggling with one another over the power to name their children. And that's really what this chapbook is about. My mother was named for both my great-grandmothers, for my grandmother's mother and for my grandfather's mother. And that always seemed like a beautiful thing to me. But actually, this was kind of like the central battle of my grandparents' life. And my grandmother never forgave my grandfather for naming my mother both names. And when my grandfather passed away at the age of 98, he had been in the hospital for almost a year. He was completely paralyzed at that point, could barely breathe. And the last thing he said to my mother before he died was, I should have let her have the name. And that was like his last words. And that just haunted me. And this little battle that seems like it's nothing actually kind of defined our family life. And so much of this chapbook is about that, and how could a name mean so much, and how could it get to a point that it could destroy the generation afterwards. So I'm going to just read 3 pieces that I think give a sense of the pacing of the book. This book does not have a plot in the traditional sense. It's a poetry book, but it was also about giving enough information so that you could get a sense of the underlying plot that isn't said openly. So the first poem is My Grandmother Looks Back. Look now behind thee, lest thou be consumed. Genesis 19:17. The angel said not to, but angels are not to be trusted. They're all mission and disguises, and the dead do come back. Her own father returned as a beggar, crouched outside the station door. Her husband runs ahead, arms swinging, easy to move when his body never sank with the weight of another's being, to float when a salt sea never splashed in his belly. So easy not to look, with no cord stretched taut, bleeding yet refusing to rupture. Look not, say the angels, yet who will bear witness? Who will count the burning windows and subtract them? one by one. And have a series of poems about my grandfather, when my grandfather was Abram, when my grandfather was Isaac, and I'm going to read when my grandfather was Jacob. When my grandfather was Jacob, he stole the birthright from my grandmother. He didn't mean to, but he loved his mother, and my grandmother was so tired unto death. He knew the right to a firstborn's name goes to the mother. Let's split it, he said, with nothing to barter. Half of your mother, half of mine. She refused. He took. He knew even then a thief is fined twice. A fee he could not pay, a fury he could not flee. Stealing the birthright. The rabbi told him not to do it. It belongs to the mother. Let her name the child. Zadie said, but who knows if I'll have another? The rabbi said, I bless you that you will have another daughter. Let your wife have the name. Zadie sat silent. He seemed to be listening. He always did as he was told. When Rebbetzin Bloch said that the first birth goes slowly, that the baby would not be born for hours, he listened. He went to the yeshiva to daven. Bubby remained standing outside the yeshiva door. The debate began. How could she get to the hospital on Shabbos? Labor had just started. Should she walk? Call an ambulance? The rabbi still hovered. Pointing at his wife, he said, you take her, now. The debate stopped. Rebbetzin Bloch drove Bubby to the hospital. Zadie stayed in the yeshiva through Musaf. They told him not to worry. It will take time. He listened and stayed for Kiddush, then set off on foot. He always listened to what people told him, like a good little yeshiva bacher, my grandmother would say. They said it goes slow, so he stayed for Shacharis, then Torah reading, then Musaf, Kiddush, herring, kugel. My grandmother gave birth alone. Holding her baby, all she wanted to do was feed her. Fill her up till she brimmed with milk, as Bubby had never been filled. The nurses patiently explained to the ignorant immigrant that formula is much more sanitary, that it is scientifically designed to be healthy for babies. Bubby was stubborn. She found a doctor who spoke Russian and who was also ignorant. He agreed to sneak her the baby. She held the tiny creature she could not believe had come from her body, could not believe had nestled and turned in her shrunken belly. Even when Bubby had stretched herself over the Maharal's grave, begging for a child, she hadn't believed she would hold life in her hands. She had starved for so long she no longer mensurated. Now her body was dripping food. The baby gripped her breasts with 5 perfect fingers. She remembered her mother's fingers as she lit the candles, how her swollen hands gleamed, suddenly beautiful. Mine, she thought. Tzipora Chiena. My little bird brought to life. This was the one gift she could give her mother, abandoned in a beggar's grave at the outskirts of Moscow. Sorry. My grandfather finally arrived. He watched the small, curled form in awe. He remembered the last time he had seen his mother. It was right after his sister's wedding. As he prepared to return to yeshiva, his mother had clung to him and cried. I'll be back, he assured her. 4 weeks later, she was dead, shot in the back by the Eisensgruppen. He tried not to imagine the slow topple of her body into a ditch. In his mind, she was still clothed, gleaming in wedding finery. Sometimes he could feel her tears stinging his dry eyes. Chasya Miriam, he crooned to the sleeping infant. Chasya, God shows care. Miriam, who watched her brother as he floated on the waters, the hidden eyes that would never give up. The rabbi told him to give in. The rabbi told him to let it go. My grandfather always listened. He could hear the echo of his mother weeping. All of Israel waited for Miriam in the desert. All of Israel sat in mourning when Miriam died. And look, God had showed him everlasting care in the little baby that guzzled from his wife. Let's split the name, he said. She'll be both Tzipora and Chasya. Bubby refused. She didn't believe in halves. Her beautiful baby with her 10 fingers, 10 toes, her milky skin was a perfect whole. It's dangerous to call down the destiny of those who died young, Zadie tried. Better to make a change. She should be neither fully one nor the other. Bubby didn't want to change. She wanted her mother. But it was Zadie who went to the yeshiva to give the name. He stood before the rabbi and congregation and named his daughter Tzipora Chasya. The rabbi told him not to do it. This one time, he didn't listen. The last thing he said to my mother, I should have let her have the name. What made it very difficult to write about my grandparents and to discuss any of this was that they lived in this kind of small enclave of Yiddish-speaking Holocaust survivors. And I would go there in the summer, and it was like entering another world. And there was no way to describe it to anybody outside this world. And also, I was always getting everything from the side because everybody spoke Yiddish. And I would understand a few words, and I wouldn't understand the rest. And so it was like swimming in and out of a different reality. And it was a reality that like never changed. My grandparents got older, but it was like you'd come there and time had, it stood still. Stuff in their house was still the stuff they got from the joint when they moved to America, and nothing changed. And I was in this deep mourning and trying to write about it, but anything I would write just, it couldn't convey what the experience was of being with them, and these kind of very archetypal figures that just don't seem part of modern reality. And so in the end, and I think you could get this even from the selection I wrote, the only way I was able to write about it was to write through their own world, and their world was the biblical world. When my grandmother wanted to talk about being angry at God, she didn't talk about her brothers. She didn't talk about her mother. She spoke about King Saul and how God had treated King Saul and how terribly unfair it was. And she had this list of all the things she was going to talk to God about, and King Saul was at the top. And so I said, okay, you know what? Their world was Tanakh. Their world was Midrash. And so the only way I could kind of convey them and really give a sense of what they were like to me and to many people who knew them was to write about them through the archetypes they lived in. And so the whole book is written through the Tanakh from the beginning, which is Lot's wife looking back, through Saul, since that was my grandmother's obsession. And my grandfather, who was, as my mother always said, the good yeshiva boy, I used much more mainstream archetypes of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and my grandmother, who was so angry and so bitter and in a wild fury her whole life. It was always the more transgressive archetype. So she became the witch of Endor, and all these people who are at the edge of the Bible, who are there but not there. And that was a way of kind of approaching her and also getting apart this. To talk about them in human terms just didn't get across the presence. And so that's how this book is structured. It's structured around these biblical archetypes. I can read the title of the poems and then it becomes quite clear. It's My Grandmother Looks Back, Questions I Never Asked My Grandfather. And then When My Grandfather Was Abraham, Bubby's Calendar. When My Grandfather Was Isaac, Who Knows One. When My Grandfather Was Jacob, Stealing the Birthright. When My Grandmother Was Rachel, My Grandmother Searches for Joseph. When My Grandmother Was the Witch of Endor, and My Grandmother and King Saul. When My Grandfather Was David. And then in the end, I have a poem called Confessional, in which I imagine interrogating my grandfather. It was kind of the one thing I never did. My grandfather only spoke Yiddish, and he thought he spoke English, but it was extremely difficult to understand. And he understood Hebrew very well, but his accent was so heavy, it was very, very difficult to make out what he meant. And so it's this imaginary dialogue that I had with my grandfather of what was his relationship with my grandmother. And that ends the book. And it was a difficult poem to write. It was a poem I wasn't sure I was going to publish because it kind of uncovered family secrets that I was terrified to put out there. And in the end, I chopped half of it. And even so, I'm kind of like afraid for my mother's siblings to see this. So it's this book, and I tell myself, well, nobody really reads poetry, so it's safe. Yeah. And I think my time is up. So
Thank you. Thank you so much, Batnadiv, for reading those poems and for sharing all of that with us. Okay, I'm going to introduce our final author for the night. Lynne Golodner is the award-winning author of 10 books and hundreds of essays and articles that have appeared in publications around the world. With a BA from the University of Michigan and an MFA from Goddard College, Lynne spent 15 years in New York, Washington, and Detroit as a journalist before creating a marketing and public relations company. Now she helps authors build marketing strategies for their books while also teaching writing, leading writing retreats, and writing novels, including Woman of Valor and Cave of Secrets. Lynne is the mother of 4 young adults and lives in Detroit with her archivist husband. Lives with her archivist husband in the Detroit suburbs. So, Lynne, spotlight you.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for including me today, Julie, and thank you to everyone for being here to hear about our books. Fascinating that all three of us are writing about ancestry and its impact and legacy and about secrets. I first got the idea for the novel that became Cave of Secrets in the summer of 2022 when I spent a month in the Scottish Highlands on a writing sabbatical. I rented a little house in the village of Tomatin, about 20 minutes south of Inverness, where there are 3 bridges, 1 cafe, and an excellent whiskey distillery. I say I went there for a writing sabbatical, but if I'm honest, I didn't have a writing project ready to work on. So once I'd settled in, I pondered what exactly I would be writing. And since my author brand focuses on writing stories with strong Jewish characters, I began to research Jews in Scotland to see what I could find to inspire my next project. It's an unusual choice, of course, to focus on Jews in Scotland, which is not a country known for its Jewish community. Indeed, today the Jewish population is less than 1% of Scotland's total population, though that wasn't always the case. Nonetheless, I found some interesting characters and started to get to know them. So, as Julie said, I've written nonfiction and poetry about Jewish identity and experiences in my first 8 books and in individual pieces that I've published around the world. So my first novel, Woman of Valor, focused on a religious protagonist in the Orthodox world of Chicago. And Cave of Secrets has no religious main characters, but Jewish identity threads through this story in major ways. So I'm going to start by reading an excerpt from the first chapter, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how this book came to be more specifically. So this is in the voice of Eve, who's one of 4 protagonists, and the book takes place between July 2014 and the end of 2016, and so this is where it begins. If Eve had known a storm was coming, she wouldn't have set out on a 4-mile hike through the forests around Loch Lomond, but she was 2 miles in as a rush of cool air pimpled her arms. The first drops fell cold on her face, and she scanned beyond the trail for a place to shelter as a crack of thunder split the dark sky and fat raindrops drenched her hair. Before the rain pelted down, Eve had sat on the nub of a hill and stared over the fault line that traced from the summit all the way down to the loch and along 3 islands evenly spaced in the glassy water, the dividing line between the highlands and the lowlands, the line between the person she had been and the person she was about to become. She had no time to pull out the gray rain jacket she'd bought before coming to Scotland because it promised to be easily packable and lightweight. It was balled up in her backpack, and as the skies opened up, she didn't want to stop to find it and risk drenching the notebook she took everywhere to jot down thoughts and questions for future research. Eve ran into a thicket of trees, ducking under the fragrant arms of an evergreen for cover. She was at the plateau in the climb with a perfect view of the black water which drank in the rain. The soil under her feet darkened as it turned gummy with mud. Deeper into the trees, Eve spotted an opening, and she went for it, darting beneath branches and over knotty roots until it came clearer into view. The cave was wide and quiet and humid. Ducking inside, she sank to the ground to catch her breath, sliding off her pack and dropping it in the dirt as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. The cave calmed her and warmed her prickling flesh. Heat emanated from the slate walls. The ground was flat and moist, the silence soothing. Eve walked deeper in, shaking the rain from her arms. The storm was unlikely to go long. She would wait until it slowed and the skies brightened, and then she'd tread carefully down the slick mountain paths. The dim light glinted off a flat surface where the rock wall met the sandy floor. Eve knelt closer, trying to see what had caught the light. A leather-bound satchel lay half buried, half revealed in the dirt. She poked into the soil, drawing open the earth. Palming the package, she slowly peeled it open to peer inside. The pages were smooth and not too soil-streaked, the letters faded but readable. The first page read like a letter, though there was no date to identify or by whom. Eve squinted in the low light to make out the words which brushed across the page in elegant, formal script. The author certainly had exquisite penmanship. My darling Benjamin, I have counted the days until you would return to my waiting arms, my insistent kisses. But now I know you never will. The telegram arrived to the Foundation offices in London, and a messenger ferried it to me here. News of your demise, your sinking at sea. Oh, my dear Benjamin, how will I continue without you? I write here in the privacy of my rooms all the things I wish I could say aloud. I can tell no one that this baby I carry is yours. No one to wail to about the loss of my life's love. Hugh suspects, of course, for we have lived as sister and brother all these many years since I found you and released him to his secrets. But he will wear the face of father for this baby, who will never know his true lineage, never know his kind, patient, selfless father, whom I loved more than I've ever loved anyone. Now that you've gone to your eternal rest, I will go about the business of raising my children, the last of whom will carry your gleaming smile, your tender eyes, your open heart, your giving soul. I will hold you in my heart always, along with the memories of our enduring love. I pray that the brief time we had will be a beacon, brightening my days and softening my nights, as I gaze at the round moon alone, without your tender touch, without a companion, without you, my darling. I remain forever yours, Shira. So there were three historical figures who inspired this story. Asher, who was Scotland's first Jewish doctor, Hannah de Rothschild, the wealthiest woman in England when she inherited her father's estate at the age of 25, and her Scottish Protestant aristocratic husband, Archibald Primrose, Earl of Rosebery. So I first set out to write a historical fiction novel based on these three real-life people. And in fact, I wrote 20,000 words in that direction before I reached out to the modern-day descendants of Hannah and Archibald to see if I could interview them about their ancestors and visit their castle on the outskirts of Edinburgh. To my surprise, they didn't want their ancestors being fictionalized, and I couldn't meet them or visit their castle, which is open to the public in the summer months. My first reaction as a rebellious author was to huff and puff and be offended. And then I sent the email to my attorney to ask if I could, in fact, write about these people. He said they had no legal standing and I could write about them, but they could make life difficult for me, so why didn't I just change the names? It was then that I remembered I don't write historical fiction, though I love to read it. So I scrapped the 20,000 words and I set out to plan a contemporary novel based on these historical figures, and that became Cave of Secrets. So this book is a contemporary story of romance, suspense, and a little magical realism in the form of visits from the spirits of ancestral figures. The book takes place in Michigan and in Scotland, places I know well. Michigan is where I'm from, so two of the main characters, Eve and her father Sam, live in Ann Arbor, though Sam was raised in the Orthodox Jewish community of Oak Park, where I once lived. It's just 2 miles from where I am now. The other two protagonists, Mac and his mother Margaret, are Scottish aristocrats with an estate near Loch Lomond. So when I speak about this book, people ask me two questions. What is my pull to Scotland, and are there Scottish Jews? To answer the first question, I'll say at first I didn't know what drew me to Scotland. The Highlands comprise the sparsely populated mountainous region north of Edinburgh and Glasgow, and the landscape is breathtakingly gorgeous. I love mountains and ocean, and places that offer both, like Scotland, truly draw my interest. And in fact, for my first honeymoon in 2000, when I was an Orthodox Jew, we traveled to Scotland, shipping kosher food to all of our destinations. A costly endeavor and a lot of work, but well worth it. But I think it goes deeper than that. So the Scots are a proud people connected to heritage, culture, and land, just like the Jews. After the 1746 Battle of Culloden, which was the last battle between the British and the Highlanders after a series of uprisings against colonization, the British did everything in their power to suppress or erase Scottish culture. So they made it illegal to wear a tartan, which is the plaid that represents a person's clan or family. They outlawed the speaking of Gaelic, which was the native Scottish language. And they disbanded clans and dispersed individual families to live on tiny plots of land known as crofts, which were rocky and hard to farm, and that led to starvation and poverty. Thus, many Scots left their native land for all points on the globe, creating a Scottish diaspora, which is a word they use to describe it. In 2022, when I spent a month in the Highlands, I attended a program called the Storyland Sessions in the Cairngorm Mountains and met a woman who's now my friend, author Maren Glover, and she said something that crystallized my love for Scotland. She said that Scottish identity and culture is wrapped up in music, language, work, and land, and Scots are connected by an age-old tradition of storytelling. Well, I'd say the same for Jews. Today, there's a vibrant, proud Scottish diaspora and groups like the St. Andrews Society that perpetuate Scottish culture and connect people through based events and gatherings. And one such event is the Highland Games, which includes sport competitions, Scottish dancing, fife and drum bands, food, drink, clan gatherings, all of that. And in fact, I did an early launch for the book at the Michigan Highland Games, which was great fun. And I sold more books there than I have at like any event I've ever been to. But I travel a lot, and wherever I go, I look for the writers and I look for the Jews. And when I was in Scotland, I found both. I joined local writers groups, I went to author talks, I met local writers, and I was invited for Shabbat in little corners of this vast land. And these experiences and people usually inspire my writing. So in answer to the second question, in Scotland, the Jewish community is small, but strongly identifying. The first documentation of Jews in Scotland is from 1290, when England expelled the Jews, but the first organized community of Jews was not established until 1816 in Edinburgh, although there were Jews throughout Scottish history. Then in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, mass immigration from Eastern Europe brought many more Jews. And by the 1930s, Scotland's Jewish population numbered 20,000, largely due to an influx of refugees from Nazi Germany and other countries under German occupation. By 2011, which is the most recent statistics I found, fewer than 6,000 Jews lived in Scotland, totaling less than 1% of the population and concentrated mostly in Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Aberdeen, where there are all our universities. There are 2 synagogues in Edinburgh, and the University of Edinburgh has a Jewish society. Glasgow is home to 6 synagogues and the Scottish Jewish Archive Center. And I just want to finish by sharing a few quick details about the real people who inspired the characters of Shira, Benjamin, and Hugh, who are the ancestors of the contemporary characters. So Asher was born in Glasgow in 1837, and he moved to London in 1862, and he became a pillar in the London Jewish community. The Rothschild Foundation funded his world travels to administer healthcare in poor Jewish communities. I've found no evidence that he and Hannah de Rothschild ever crossed paths, but it is entirely likely because her family foundation did fund his travels. Hannah de Rothschild became the Countess Primrose, and she was proudly Jewish, even though she intermarried and her kids were raised Christian. She was incredibly philanthropic in public health and for working class Jewish women. Of her 4 children with Archibald, one of her sons served as Secretary of State under Winston Churchill. When she married Archibald, Benjamin Disraeli walked her down the aisle, though few of her relatives attended because she was marrying outside the faith. And her husband Archibald was rumored to be gay. It's widely published that that was a rumor. I haven't found confirmation of it. They were fond of each other, but really lived as partners more than husband-wife. And after Hannah's death, he soared to political renown, serving as England's prime minister for just 1 year, but he did change the face of British election campaigning, and he was the one who coined the term the British Commonwealth of Nations. So these 3 people I found really fascinating, and they inspired this story, which is entirely fiction. So I really appreciate you listening. I hope you enjoy the story you'll find in Cave of Secrets, and thanks again, Julie, for having me today.
So much, Lynn. I'm gonna add all of our spotlights So while you guys can write some questions in the chat. Spotlight and ask to mute. Your spotlight. Yeah. Okay. Well, while our audience is thinking of questions, I have a few questions. And one is it's for all three of you, which is, how did you decide? I mean, Batnadiv was talking about which poems she could include, but it really is ask the same question for the novels as well. Like which, because both had to do a lot of research for your books. Like, how did you kind of navigate that? What to include, what not to include? Since there are a lot of writers on the call, but also a lot of readers. But it's always fascinating for everybody to hear your processes, how you make those decisions. And I'm going through it myself. So. Who wants to start?
I can start if you want. This book was so much easier to write than my first novel because I really planned it out and did a lot of research ahead of time. And I challenged myself to write 4 storylines that merged together and interwove as the book progressed. So that was more of a challenge for me to see if I could pull it off and if I could do it. But I think because I had tried the first round as historical fiction and then I threw that out, I sort of knew that I wanted to relegate the historical figures to sort of the background, not make them the focus. And so I had to create the contemporary story that would be the forefront. And what fascinated me in writing Cave of Secrets was that I was going to have Eve interact with the historical documents that she found as she's pursuing her archival fellowship. But I didn't anticipate that they would just sort of appear in this like bit of magical realism, which it's not really my genre. And so even though I planned it out, what was really fun about the writing was like they sort of took on a life of their own and emerged in that way. And I think added such an interesting element to the story. And so that was something that I embellished and I expanded on, but I didn't anticipate it coming. And I think that gave it sort of an interesting twist.
Fun, makes it more fun.
Yeah.
To be surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, Julie. So I have 2 timelines in my book because I think I mentioned World War II is one, and there we only see Efim going through the war, and then alternates with I'm calling it my war and peace structure, if you will. Sorry, Tolstoy. But the peace chapters alternate and are told through different points of view. Some through Efim, some through Nina, the 2 kids, and a granddaughter appears because they span 70 years. So we see characters growing up and having kids and stuff. But the World War II part is all him, and all I had to go on was this very short, it's literally a page and a half, letter to the KGB that's very sort of factual. It's like I was there and then I was captured and then they sent me there, and I think that place was called that, it's because he's writing it 40 years, he's writing it in the 80s, so 40 years after the war. I'm reading it in another 30 years. It's also written to the KGB, which means a lot of things. It means there's almost no emotions except for that kind of bit I read where he's begging for his family to not find this out. But everything else is very factual. So any kind of psychological work I had to do on my own, right? I had to make this person, this soldier, this prisoner of war who's Jewish and is trying to survive 4 years in Germany, have like a whole depth of psychological depth. And then it's also unclear whether or not he is misremembering or concealing things, right? Like it's the KGB. You're not really gonna tell them the whole thing. But it was also very limiting because it was so, such a short, short little amount of information. So the way I think of my book is that it's kind of almost each sentence became a chapter. I took a sentence from Grandpa. Most of the book follows real places and real dates. So he's like, I was in, X camp, and then they sent me somewhere else, and then I ran away. There's escapes. There's all kinds of madness there. So it takes, as a journalist, it was helpful for me to base my fictional book on some reality and some facts. So I would take that, and then I'd have to write a whole chapter about that one sentence essentially and expand it. So yeah, for me, it was a process of expansion more than kind of choosing what to cut. Yeah.
I mean, I said a lot of it. With poetry, it really is about what you leave out. It's got to be so precise, especially a chapbook. So it really became that I only included things that were about the relationship between my grandparents rather than my grandfather's life alone or my grandmother's life alone. And I tried to alternate my grandmother, my grandfather, my grandmother, my grandfather. And I'm kind of like, I'm the visualizer, I'm the speaker, but I'm not really there except in the background. And that was kind of the structuring principle. And anything that didn't fit into that was just cut out. And it's not that it was bad. I hope it will be included in a later collection, but this needed to be very, very, very specific. So it became the prism was the relationship, and anything that fit that went in, and anything that didn't did not.
Makes it easier in a way. Like to have that very structured.
Yeah, so it took me years to realize that that's the structure. It went through so many different structures, and then this kind of like it kept getting smaller and smaller and more distilled, and then I was like, okay, this is what it is. But it took a very long time to discover that this is what it is, because it really started with my grandfather's diary. And so there were all these things about the diary and about him and about his experiences. And it was just like, actually, this is not what this is about. This is about something else.
It's so amazing how like we can find so much about our relatives, like I'm also my current writing project, which I hope will be a novel, is inspired by my great aunt, and I keep digging and finding more and more things about her. She was killed in Auschwitz, but she had, was 42 when that happened. So, but there's just so much you can find. That I like what you were saying, Sasha, about the expansion. I once took a class with One Story magazine, Hannah Tinty, and she taught this class about writing like the 5-sentence story. And she had a very like specific structure that she guided people to follow. And then, but each day, like you would then take each sentence and expand it into a paragraph, and then expand it into a chapter. And so it sounds like what you did with the letter from your grandfather.
I wanted to actually add, for any writers here, this might be interesting. When my editor at Bloomsbury, the first thing she told me, she said, Sasha, we're going to expand this novel and then we'll cut. And I was like, okay. I mean, it was already like at over 100,000 words. But she wanted to expand it, and I fully believed her, and she totally lied because we never cut anything out. We did expand. It grew like another 10,000 words, and it just kept, and she never cut. And then when I was sort of going through the very last kind of copy edit type drafts, I started cutting. I was like, okay, it's moving too slowly. Like, let's go. I'm just getting stuck in here. So yeah, but she never cut. I'm like, come on, Grace.
Yeah, when my book is published by a small publisher, and I was all excited to get their edits. And like I got the edits, and there were no edits. Like I like my book, but I'm sure it could be better. Like for the sentence, and they really just had like if I had written a number as the number, like 11, they would write it out as a numeral or add a comma or take it. That was it. I'm like, okay, so then I ended up hiring on my own dime an editor, not to do developmental editing, but just like on the sentence level to like make them shine a bit more. So, and that was, I thought was money well spent. But yeah, I was surprised about the lack of editing. So,
I had a friend who has a major book out. It's nonfiction, but it's like huge, on the bestseller list. And the same thing. They didn't edit it. The editor just bought it basically at this crazy auction, and that was it. Like he couldn't care less at what it was, which is very common with nonfiction books. They don't get edited very much. Because they're very fad based typically. Anyway, and so he decided to hire one on his own. So yeah, it happens with like really.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah. I know, I was kind of shocked. I was like, really?
As someone who worked as an editor in a literary press, I'm horrified because like there's no such thing as a book that doesn't need an edit. Even really good books, they always need an edit.
Yeah.
Which press did you work at?
I worked at Toby Press, which later became Magid, but originally was a literary press that worked on the Hebrew classics.
I always tell my writing students that writing is 80% revision.
Yeah.
The number of edits that I go through before it ever goes to the editor or early readers is, much more than the drafting of it. And so I think that gives them a little bit of solace, like, oh, okay, I understand the journey and the way it's going to go. So
yeah, I like most of these poems just started as lists, like long lists. And yeah, the first draft is getting it out there. You gotta vomit it on the page, and then comes the actual, for me at least, all the artistry comes in the revisions and the cutting it down, not in that initial draft.
for sure.
Okay, before everyone leaves, there were a couple questions in the chat. Ellen was asking when will the books be available in paperback, and do they have discussion guides? Lynn, I know you already answered her in the chat, but Sasha and Batnadiv, and also there was a question, Batnadiv, about where people can
So
find
my
copies.
book is published by Kelsey Books, and it's available through Kelsey or through Amazon or Barnes and Noble and all the big online publishers. I did have some here in Jerusalem and Adarabba, but I'm not sure if there are any left. And it's available in the Bar Ilan library. I'm not sure if it's available in other libraries.
Hi, David. I don't know what country you're in. So
US.
US. Okay. Then my book is available in, I think, most libraries from what I understand. It is going to be available in paperback next year. They haven't told me. They're supposed to tell me like now, but I haven't heard. But sometime usually it's a year from the hardback. So sometime next spring. But it is in libraries and on Kindle and audio. And it will, sorry, and the other part of your question, discussion guides, it will, I need to put up a discussion guide actually on my website because I have one and it's somewhere on the internet. My publisher has it, but the paperback will include that.
I don't see other questions, and it's getting a little bit late. So I just want to say a couple things to the audience, which is the next three literary Modiin events have already been scheduled. Actually, on October 6th, we are having another special Israel solidarity session with you'll hear from a number of Israeli writers and one from outside of Israel, with short readings, poems and other readings, commemorating 1 year since October 7th. And then our November event is on November 10th with Sarah Seltzer, Talia Karner, and Helen Motro. And our December event is going to be an in-person and hybrid event. So anybody who's in driving distance of Modiin, I hope we'll see you in person. And that's going to be with Ayelet Sabari and a few others. So, and before we go, and as I do all of these events since October 7th, I am going to read now Mishberach, a prayer for captives. You can read along with me and follow along with me in Hebrew or read in English. מי שברך אבותינו ואמותינו אברהם ושרה יצחק ורבקה יעקב לאה ורחל ואת לוחמינו יהושע דוד ויהודה דבורה יעל ויהודית הוא יברך את שבויי ונעדרי צה"ל והאזרחים והאזרחיות החטופים והחטופות הנתונות בשביה ובצרה. יהי רצון מלפניך אדוני צבאות שתפדה נפשם משבי ותחזירם במהרה לארצם למשפחתם ולביתם בריאים ושלמים בגופם ובנפשם ותיתן תבונה בלב העמלים לשחרורם ותיתן רחמים בלב שוביהם יקוים בהם הכתוב קול ברמה נשמע יהי בכי תמרורים רחל מבכה על בניה מענה הנחם על בניה כי איננו כה אמר אדוני מעיד קולך מבכי ועינייך מדמעה כי יש שכר לפעולתך נאום אדוני ושבו מארץ אויב ויש תקווה לאחריתך נאום אדוני ושבו בנים ובנות לגבולם. And that is from Sefer Yirmiyahu, the book of Jeremiah. So I want to thank everybody. Wait, there's two more chats. Okay. I want to thank you all for being with us, and special thanks to Sasha, Lynne, and Batnadiv for sharing your words and your books and your inspiration. Really enjoyed listening to all of you, and I hope you all did too. I'm going to send around, as I always do, send around an email with the links and where you can buy their books and how you can support their writing and all of that. So, and one thing, oh, I actually forgot to ask you this, Sasha, because someone mentioned to me that your book has been review bombed on Goodreads. So do you want to say anything about that? It's very important to review the books, Goodreads and Amazon, so we can avoid things like this.
Yeah, the story behind it is that I published a piece in the New York Times that came out 2 days after my book came out. And the headline was chosen by them, and I was very against it, but they kind of pushed for it, and it's very provocative. And it's lots of it is behind paywall, so I don't think a lot of people read it, but the headline was Speaking Russian in America. And so Ukrainians who are super, super sensitive right now, but don't know anything really about me or the book or have access to the book. There's kind of a brigading situation where one person started this like hate campaign, and a lot of random Ukrainian young people on the internet decide to join and sort of copy paste. So it was not fun, but yeah, the people who read the book tend to really like it. It's been very well reviewed. So, I just kind of don't look at Goodreads, which is
wise advice for anybody not to look at Goodreads.
Yeah.
All right, but good luck with that, and hope we can be a force of positive reviews for anybody who does look at Goodreads. So that tied back. So
yeah,
thank you again, everyone.
Thank you, Julie.
Maybe
nice to meet you.
hear good news soon. Sorotovot, and maybe have a quiet month, days, years. May things.
May you be able to go bike riding.
Yeah,
Right.
and swimming.
No more bombs there or there.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Julie. Appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Yep. Night.